Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. Rome fell because its money died first. In the crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 AD, the silver denarius, once 95% pure under Augustus, was debased to less than 5% silver under Emperor Gallienus. By the year 268 AD, a coin that once bought a legionary's monthly pay could barely purchase a few loaves of bread. Over 50 emperors rose and fell in just 50 years. Most were murdered. 70 million people watched 500 years of civilization collapse in a single generation. Savings evaporated. Soldiers' retirement funds earned after 25 years of bleeding on the frontiers from Britain to Syria became worthless overnight. Yet here is the brutal truth, almost no one dares to say out loud. While the majority lost everything, a handful of Roman families didn't just survive the collapse, they emerged richer, more powerful, and more secure than they had ever been before. How? They protected their wealth with 4 specific assets. Assets that not only held value through one of history's most catastrophic economic implosions, but actually transferred enormous real power to those who understood them. One of those assets is something every modern financial advisor today would call reckless, dangerous, and financially irresponsible. But the Roman elites who held it didn't merely survive the fall of Rome. They quietly rewrote their family's destiny for centuries to come. In this 5-minute deep dive, I'm not going to give you surface-level history. I'm going to break down the hidden mechanics of wealth transfer during monetary collapse, the exact distinctions between paper claims and real value that most historians gloss over, the counterintuitive role of debt that mainstream education never teaches, and the precise perception shifts that separated the destroyed from the dominant. By the end of this video, you will see money, assets, and systemic risk with completely new eyes. Stay with me until the end, because what Rome revealed in Blood and Bronze is happening again faster in our own hyper-complex financial system. And only those who truly understand the difference will come out on the other side stronger. To understand what truly survived, we must first look directly at what killed the Roman economy from within. The denarius wasn't just another coin, it was confidence you could hold in your hand. Under Emperor Augustus, it contained nearly 95% pure silver, roughly 4 grams of actual silver in every single piece. Every legionnaire's salary, every merchant's profit margin, every farmer's life savings depended on that coin. It wasn't merely money. It was trust made physical. Then the bills of running a vast empire started arriving. Defending thousands of miles of frontier against Germanic tribes pressing from the north, and the powerful Sassanid Persians striking from the east demanded spending far beyond what any tax system could sustainably raise. So the emperors chose the easiest path governments have always chosen when obligations outstrip revenue. They cheated the currency. By the early 3rd century, under Caracalla, the silver content of the denarius had fallen to roughly 50%. The coin still looked identical on the surface, bore the same imperial portraits, and carried the same nominal value, but half the silver had quietly been replaced with cheap bronze. Under Emperor Gallienus, a ruler who faced no fewer than 23 rival claimants to the throne in just 15 years, the situation became catastrophic. The denarius dropped to less than 5% silver. In the worst issues, it contained as little as 2 to 3%. Scratch the surface, and the thin silver wash would flake away, revealing dull base metal beneath. The Roman people noticed. They always do. Prices began to spiral. Merchants refused to accept the debased coins for essential imports from distant provinces. Soldiers demanded higher pay to compensate for the lost purchasing power. Farmers abandoned their fields rather than deliver grain in exchange for worthless metal. The sophisticated trade networks that had connected 70 million people across the empire, from the olive groves of Spain to the grain fields of Egypt and the dye workshops of Syria, started fracturing at every seam. Between 235 and 284 AD, the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome suffered military collapse, devastating plagues, endless civil wars, and total economic implosion all at once. Nearly 50 emperors rose and fell in those 50 years. Most were murdered shortly after taking power. The once mighty empire that had stood for centuries was tearing itself apart like wet parchment. This was not random chaos. This was the predictable consequence of a monetary system that had lost its soul, the slow, deliberate poisoning of public trust through currency debasement. And yet, in the heart of this nightmare, 4 assets stood firm. They didn't survive because they were popular during times of prosperity. They endured because they could not be easily faked, could not be quietly diluted, and could not be made irrelevant when the entire system around them failed. In the following sections, we will examine each of these 4 assets with the depth and honesty they deserve, including the uncomfortable truths and counterintuitive mechanisms that most financial commentators deliberately avoid. The first asset may sound familiar at first glance, but the real lesson Rome teaches us about it is far more nuanced and far more valuable than the simple statement, gold survives collapses. The first asset may sound familiar at first glance, but the real lesson Rome teaches us about it is far more nuanced and far more valuable than the simple statement, gold survives collapses. Yes, gold endured, but not all gold was equal, and not everyone who held gold came through the crisis intact. In 312 AD, after years of chaos, Constantine the Great took a decisive step that would reshape Mediterranean commerce for the next 7 centuries. He introduced a new gold coin called the solidus 2-4, carat pure, weighing exactly 4.5 grams, struck with consistent purity and precise weight in every mint across the empire, no debasement. No political games with the metal content, no silver wash hiding bronze underneath. This was not just another coin, it was a declaration of war against the monetary destruction that had been rotting Rome from the inside for over a century. The market responded almost immediately. Merchants who had been forced to trade in grain, silk, or raw materials because nobody trusted the denarius suddenly had a reliable medium of exchange again. The solidus quickly became the currency of the wealthy, the internationally connected, and anyone conducting serious business across political boundaries. Even after the western half of the empire dissolved into competing Germanic kingdoms, the solidus remained the backbone of trade. Byzantine merchants were still using it in the 11th century, more than 700 years after Constantine first struck it. But here is the deeper perception shift that most history books never highlight, and the one that has cost people fortunes in every subsequent collapse. It wasn't simply owning gold that protected those families. It was owning gold that could be independently verified, weighed, tested, and trusted in direct transactions without needing any institutional guarantee. During the height of the crisis in the 3rd century, the underground gold market was chaotic. Coins were clipped, bars were adulterated, weights were falsified. The people who survived weren't merely those who possessed gold. They were those who held gold whose purity and weight could be confirmed on the spot, by balance scale, by touch, by fire, by any counterparty in a face-to-face deal. Historian Kyle Harper's detailed research on late Roman economic life shows how the wealthy classes increasingly demanded payment in aurum, pure gold, by weight rather than in any specific coin denomination. They had already internalized the core truth. The coin itself had become a political instrument, subject to manipulation by whoever held power. The metal, when properly verified, was the actual store of value. This distinction between the asset and the paper claim on the asset is not a Roman problem, it is a permanent feature of any monetary system under stress. Rome didn't teach us that gold is automatically safe. Rome taught us that what cannot be diluted cannot be debased. Think about that for a moment. In today's world, when central banks expand balance sheets at unprecedented speed and financial instruments grow ever more complex, the same question returns with greater urgency. Are you holding the metal itself verifiable, portable, and independent of any institution? Or are you holding a promise written on paper, a digital entry, or a derivative layered on top of another derivative? The Roman senator who kept his wealth in debased denarii in 300 AD was financially destroyed by 360 AD. The same senator who had quietly converted his position into verified, consistent purity gold maintained his economic standing through the worst of the collapse and in many cases passed greater wealth to the next generation. That is the first perception shift this video delivers. True wealth preservation in times of monetary breakdown is not about owning the popular asset. It is about owning the version of that asset that cannot be quietly corrupted by the system itself. And this principle leads us directly to the second asset, one so counterintuitive that it is almost never discussed in mainstream conversations about Rome's fall. Yet financial historians document it with mathematical precision. It is the strategic use of debt during currency collapse. And this principle leads us directly to the second asset, one so counterintuitive that it is almost never discussed in mainstream conversations about Rome's fall. Yet financial historians document it with mathematical precision. It is the strategic use of debt during currency collapse. Sit with this for a moment, because what comes next permanently changes how you understand wealth transfer in broken monetary systems. During Rome's hyper-debasement, being a debtor became one of the most powerful financial positions you could hold. Here is exactly how it worked. Imagine a Roman landowner in 200 AD who borrows 100,000 denarii to purchase a productive agricultural estate just outside the city. At that time, those 100,000 denarii represent real purchasing power enough to acquire fertile land, slaves, and equipment that generate steady income for years. By 280 AD, after decades of relentless debasement, the silver content in the denarius has collapsed by over 90%. The same 100,000 denarii now buys only what a few sacks of grain would have cost in 200 AD. Prices have skyrocketed in lockstep with the loss of metal value. But the loan contract? It still demands repayment of exactly 100,000 denarii, no more, no less. The borrower repays the debt using money that has become functionally worthless. The lender, who originally extended credit when the coin still contained substantial silver, receives back bronze discs with only a thin silver wash. Inflation didn't simply erode the currency, it systematically transferred enormous wealth from creditors to debtors across the entire empire. Every fixed debt obligation denominated in nominal denarii became dramatically cheaper to repay in real terms as the currency weakened. The borrower kept the land, the productive assets, and the income they generated. The debt burden, in real economic terms, had been inflated away to almost nothing. Roman historians and modern scholars such as Peter Heather document how the senatorial class, the great landed families, actively leveraged this mechanism. Those who had borrowed heavily in the 2nd century to expand their holdings found themselves, by the late 3rd century, owning vast real assets free and clear, while their nominal obligations had shrunk into insignificance. Brian Ward Perkins's Forensic Archaeology of the Post-Roman World further confirms the pattern. While the standard of living for ordinary citizens collapsed, many of the great villa estates of the aristocracy continued to function, not at their imperial peak, but they survived and even maintained local economic power. Joseph Tainter's framework on societal collapse points to the same dynamic. When complex systems fail, they fail unevenly. The nodes that endure are those holding real productive capacity with minimal external dependencies. The Roman aristocrats who had used debt to acquire land before the currency died were precisely those nodes. Everything outside their estate walls was disintegrating. Inside, life and wealth continued. This was not unique to Rome. The exact same mechanism played out with ruthless mathematical precision during the Weimar hyperinflation of 1,923 inches Germany. Industrialists who had borrowed heavily in marks to build factories and manufacturing capacity repaid those loans with currency worth less than the paper it was printed on. They emerged owning real capital outright, while savers, bondholders, and retirees were economically annihilated. Here is the core perception shift you must internalize. Inflation is never just a tax. It is a massive, silent wealth transfer mechanism, and the direction of that transfer has always run the same way, away from those who hold paper claims and fixed income assets toward those who hold real, productive assets funded by debt in the collapsing currency. The Romans had no formal name for this principle, but the families who instinctively or deliberately understood it came through the fall of an empire with their economic position not only intact, but often strengthened. This leads us to the third asset, one that reveals why land alone was not enough, and why self-sufficiency became the ultimate hedge when complexity itself turned lethal. This leads us to the third asset, one that reveals why land alone was not enough, and why self-sufficiency became the ultimate hedge when complexity itself turned lethal. At the height of its power, Rome operated one of the most interconnected economies the ancient world had ever seen. Spanish olive oil traveled to Britain, Egyptian grain fed the capital, Syrian purple dye clothed the elite. Supply chains were long, specialized, and highly efficient for their time. When the monetary system and central authority fractured, those same supply chains snapped. A landowner whose estate depended on exporting cash crops, importing tools, or selling surplus in distant urban markets suddenly found himself stranded. His land was still physically there, but its economic function had vanished. Without the trade networks, the markets, and the stable currency, the land became far less valuable than it appeared. The estates that survived and in many cases thrived relative to the chaos operated on an entirely different logic. They were self-sufficient villas, closed-loop economies designed to function with minimal dependence on the outside world. Inside the walls of these great villas, almost everything needed for survival and basic prosperity was produced internally. Grain, vegetables, meat, timber, wool, leather, and even basic metalwork came from the estate itself. The villa maintained its own smiths, carpenters, physicians for the laborers, potters firing clay in estate kilns, and weavers producing cloth from estate wool. When the imperial trade networks contracted and eventually broke, these self-sufficient estates did not collapse with them. They had never fully depended on them. Adrian Goldsworthy's examination of the late Roman period shows that many of the great villa owners in Britain, Gaul, and North Africa deliberately increased their self-sufficiency during the 3rd and 4th centuries. They expanded grain storage, added industrial workshops, diversified agricultural output, and reduced reliance on long-distance supply lines precisely as the broader empire was unraveling around them. These were not accidental choices. They were strategic decisions based on a clear reading of the times. Rising complexity had become a liability. Self-sufficiency was the only hedge that could not be inflated away or severed by political breakdown. There is another dimension to this story that deserves its own moment of reflection. The self-sufficient villa did not merely survive economically. As the central state withdrew, tax collectors stopped coming, legions disbanded for lack of pay, roads became unsafe, and local administration collapsed. The large villa owner stepped into the vacuum. He provided security. He provided food. He provided stable employment for hundreds of people. In a landscape of dissolving institutions, the villa owner became a de facto local sovereign, the one constant amid chaos. Brian Ward Perkins documents how the social relationships that formed around these great estates in the post-Roman period eventually evolved into the foundations of medieval feudalism. The landowners, who had deliberately diversified away from imperial dependency and built internal productive capacity, did not just hold their wealth through the collapse. They became the structural backbone of the next political and economic order. Here is the critical perception shift. Real assets are not those that depend on the complexity and interconnectedness of a prosperous system. The assets that endure and even define what comes after are those that become more resilient, the simpler and more self-contained they are. Land alone did not save the Romans. Self-sufficient, internally productive land did. This brings us to the fourth and final asset, the one that acts as the ultimate sorting mechanism in every collapse, separating those who merely endure from those who continue to create value, no matter who holds political power. It is the irreplaceable human skill. This brings us to the fourth and final asset, the one that acts as the ultimate sorting mechanism in every collapse, separating those who merely endure from those who continue to create value no matter who holds political power. It is the irreplaceable human skill. Every economic collapse applies this test without mercy or exception. Your credentials do not matter. The institution that issued them does not matter. When the framework that gave your expertise its exchange value disappears, the credential collapses with it. What Rome's fall revealed, and what every subsequent collapse has confirmed across cultures and centuries, is that only two categories of human capability maintain genuine value when currencies fail and supply chains dissolve. The first category consists of skills that address immediate, unavoidable human needs. The physician who can treat infections without medicines imported from distant trade routes, the blacksmith who can forge a plowshare from scrap iron, the miller who can turn grain into flour using nothing but stone and leverage, the carpenter who can repair a leaking roof before the winter rains destroy the harvest. These people could eat even in Rome's darkest years, not because they held coins, land, or complex debt arrangements, but because what they produced could not be withheld, could not be inflated away, and could not be replaced by any political decree. A farmer whose plow breaks in April needs a blacksmith that same week. That need exists, whether the denarius contains a gram of silver or a gram of bronze, whether the emperor on the coin has been assassinated or has simply fled. The second category consists of skills that enable commerce across collapsing boundaries. Rome's disintegration did not eliminate all trade, it fragmented it. In a fractured landscape, the merchant who could operate across multiple competing political units, speak several languages, maintain trusted relationships in shifting jurisdictions, and move goods across borders that changed with every new warlord became extraordinarily valuable. Kyle Harper's documentation of the late Roman period shows that certain trading networks, particularly those linking the eastern Mediterranean ports, continued to function well into the post-Roman centuries, not at the old imperial scale, but they survived. The operators of those networks were no longer Roman citizens in any meaningful political sense. They were portable traders armed with skills, relationships, and a small stock of trusted hard currency. What happened to the professionals whose value was purely institutional? The lawyers whose practice depended on Roman civil law courts that no longer functioned? The imperial administrators whose salaries came from a treasury that had gone bankrupt? The military logistics officers of an army that disbanded when it could no longer be paid? Many of them struggled. Some adapted by repurposing their knowledge, but the collapse exposed the fragility at the core of credential-based economic identity with devastating clarity. Your value in a failing system is only as durable as the system itself. The craftsman, the physician, the adaptable merchant with portable, practical skills, these were the people who did not just survive the fall of Rome. They trained the children of the surviving aristocracy, serviced the villas that became feudal estates, and carried the practical, technical knowledge of Roman civilization forward through the centuries we now call the Dark Ages. Joseph Tainter's analysis of collapsing societies identifies this pattern with precision. Complex societies support specialists whose entire economic function depends on the maintenance of that complexity. When complexity collapses, those specialists become redundant. The skills that survive are those that function at lower levels of societal complexity skills, that still work when supply chains are broken, institutions have failed, and power has fragmented into local strongmen. Rome did not preserve its legal system, its administrative bureaucracy, or its financial sophistication through the fall. What it preserved imperfectly but genuinely were its carpenters, its physicians, its grain farmers, and its metalworkers, the people who could do the irreducible things that kept human beings alive, regardless of who claimed political power. Here is the final perception shift this asset delivers. In times of systemic breakdown, your most valuable possession is not what you own on paper. It is what you can do with your own hands and mind that other people desperately need and cannot easily replace. The four assets of Rome now stand before us with unmistakable clarity. The four assets of Rome now stand before us with unmistakable clarity. Verified, independently testable gold, not paper claims on gold. Strategic debt in a collapsing currency, the hidden mechanism that transferred real wealth from creditors to those who held productive assets. Self-sufficient estates that severed dependence on fragile imperial complexity. And irreplaceable human skills that addressed fundamental needs no political decree could erase. What Rome reveals with blood and bronze is a permanent principle of wealth. What survives a collapse is not what the system values most during prosperity. What survives is what cannot be faked, cannot be diluted, and cannot be made redundant when the system itself disappears. Rome's emperors believed they could print their way out of fiscal crisis by striking more coins from cheaper metal. They believed a coin that looked like silver was functionally equivalent to real silver. They believed the growing complexity and scale of their empire proved its permanence. They were wrong on every count. The complexity was the vulnerability. The scale made the unraveling faster, not slower. And the debasement of their currency was the silent killer that struck before any barbarian crossed the frontier. Today, our own financial system is far more complex than Rome at its height. Our currencies are more thoroughly decoupled from tangible value than even the most aggressively debased denarius. Our supply chains contain more single points of failure than the entire Roman trade network at its most stretched. Rome fell slowly, then all at once. If this 5-minute journey has changed how you think about money, about what truly holds value, about the difference between paper claims and real assets, and about how you want to position yourself and your family before the next major shift, then you now carry a rare perception shift that most people will never receive. This is exactly why the wealth perception exists. We don't study history to romanticize the past. We study it to sharpen our perception in the present so we can build real, resilient wealth that survives whatever comes next. If these insights resonated with you, do 2 things right now. First, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we go deeper into the mechanics of wealth, perception, and long-term preservation, the kind of content you won't find in conventional financial media. Second, leave a comment below. Of these 4 assets, which one are you currently strongest in? And which one will you begin strengthening first in the coming months? I read every comment and reply to as many as possible. Your thoughts often become the seed for future videos. Thank you for spending this time with me. In a world drowning in noise, the fact that you chose to invest 25 minutes in deepening your perception of wealth means you are already operating at a different level. Stay perceptive, stay resilient, and remember, true wealth is not what you own when times are good. It is what remains and what grows when the system no longer works the way it used to. I'll see you in the next video.